Welcome to the 4-drop card review with Dew. We are reviewing the neutral cards currently available for all classes to play that cost 4 mana. So, let's get started on that. We're going to be following the same schematic we have been doing so far for the card reviews. We're going to be doing the Soulbound cards first, and then cards you can get via crafting second. So, yep. Let's go into that. To start off, Chillwind Yeti, a 4-drop 4/5 with no text. He's a really good 4-drop card because, I mean, 4 stats, he's got 4 attack to start, and being a priest player, I can tell you creatures with 4 attack are incredibly annoying to deal with. Simply because pain and death don't work against him. Perhaps it kind of biases my opinion, but regardless. On top of that, having 4 attack, there are a lot of other 4 and 5-drop cards that have only 4 health, so you can trade well with those, and having 5 health, anything that has 4 attack or less won't be able to trade with him. It also puts him out of the range of a lot of spells which could deal with him. Takes him out of Wrath range. Frostbolt can't deal with him. Shadowbolt can't from Warlocks. Shadowbolt nor Soulfire can. With Rogues, Eviscerate, even when comboed, can't deal with him now. Hammer of Wrath can't, Swipe can't. So he's out of the range of a lot of spells, too, by having that 5 health. So he's just a really strong 4-drop card. Yeah, because of the stats. Yeti's just a pretty good card, and I think he's one of the best Soulbound cards that you will have. So, yeah, that's the Yeti. He's a good card. Next up, Dragonling Mechanic, a 4-drop 2/4 with a Battlecry of Summon a 2/1 Mechanical Dragonling. This technically gives the Mechanic the same stats as the Yeti, but again, by having 2 of the attacks split into a 2/1, since it only has 1 health, things like the Mage, Hunter, and Rogue hero powers can all... oh wait, Hunter, I said Hunter. It's Mage, Druid, and Rogue. Can all deal with that 2/1 and take 2 damage off of the Mechanic. On top of that, you know, trading is kind of split up. That's what the Dragonling looks like, by the way. His name is Mr. Bitey. So, yeah, while technically this card has the same combined stats as a Yeti, it's far easier to deal with than a Yeti is, because the stats are split. So, yeah, not as good as a Yeti, unfortunately. So, yeah. Don't use this card, use a Yeti instead. It's not terrible, but it's not good enough to make it worth playing. Alright, moving on. Gnomish Inventor, a 4-drop 2/4. Her stats kind of suck for her cost, but the Battlecry of Draw a Card means it's very useful as a creature card in straight up, like, if you're just using a purely beginner deck that has no crafted cards in it whatsoever and uses only soulbound cards, this is a good card to play in it because it gives you card draw, and card draw is something you really need in decks. That being said, if you're not using a soulbound based deck, there's better ways to draw cards than Gnomish Inventor, and the stats as a 4-drop creature aren't good enough to make it worth playing. So, yeah, it's good to use in a deck for someone who's brand new to the game for card draw. Otherwise, it kind of just loses its usefulness to superior cards. So yeah, that's Gnomish Inventor. Next up, Oasis Snapjaw, a 4-drop 2/7 beast. Yeah, this card, it's really difficult to deal with and remove from the field. So it can be useful in Hunter decks, and sometimes in Priest decks when you use Inner Fire. If you're curious about that card, just go check the Priest card review. That being said, it's really very rarely used because his attack stat is so low. He's useful for clearing out low mana cost cards like 2-drops and some 3-drops even, but Oasis Snapjaw is just not good enough to make him a card that you will really want to play. He's not bad, but he's not really that great either. So, yeah. That's the Snapjaw. Next up, Ogre Magi, a 4-mana 4/4 with spell damage +1. Theoretically, he's not bad, but in practice, there are better ways to gain spell damage than a 4-mana cost creature, considering a lot of times you'll find yourself in situations where you'll want to be able to play spell damage and then cast a spell immediately afterwards. So a high-cost creature isn't going to allow you to do that. On top of that, if you're playing him for the stats, we've been over this, like a Yeti is better, or, you know, there's other cards that have kind of better stats. So, yeah, all in all, not a bad card, but for both of the situational uses, for spell damage or as a creature, it just kind of falls flat. So, there's better cards. On top of that, there's a 5-drop that just makes this card completely obsolete, and we'll go over that tomorrow in the 5-drop card review, but yeah. It's okay, but it's not really gonna... You're never gonna use it. Yeah. Pretty bad card, actually. I've got to start being a lot more harsh with my judgment of cards, because a lot of times I'll be saying these cards, they're not bad, but you're not gonna use them. They're not high value enough to use, so that's one of them. Ogre Magi, not ever gonna really be used. Anyway. Senjin Shieldmaster, a 4-mana 3/5 with Taunt, basically a Yeti that loses 1 attack to gain Taunt. So, it's actually a pretty good card. It's useful as a shield, because, you know, we've said that health value means it's out of the range of a lot of different, you know, spells and ways to answer it. And on top of that, having Taunt, it means creatures have to deal with it. The 3 attack means it'll still deal with lower mana cost creatures pretty nicely. So, while it won't quite deal with creatures as well as a Yeti will, just because a Yeti has higher potential for trading, the Shieldmaster is still a pretty good card. So, yeah. For gaining that Taunt stat, the stats don't suffer too much at all. And Senjin Shieldmaster is actually a good card, even with harsher criticism. Next up, Stormwind Knight, a 4-mana 2/5 with charge. Not worth using. Not worth using. The stats suffer too much for gaining charge. While he has high health, the best trading this guy will do is with 2-drops and 3-drops, and he is a 4-drop himself. So, yeah, he's just not going to trade with things that are his mana cost at all, even if the health is higher. If they turn this thing into like a 3/4 with charge, it'd be better, but as a 2/5, it's just not good enough, you know? It won't trade well enough to make it worth playing. Blah. Next up. Okay, wait. Never mind. That's it for Soulbound 4-drops, I think. Yep. Okay, crafting mode. Make sure I don't miss anything. Okay. Ancient Brewmaster, a 4-mana 5/4, whose battlecry is return a friendly minion from the battlefield to your hand. Basically a better version of the youthful Brewmaster. His stats are pretty good, but again, he's not played that often, not because his stats aren't good, they're actually pretty great, but more because if you have a creature on the battlefield, you will be forced to bounce it back to your hand. And that's not always what you want to be doing, so the Ancient Brewmaster's highest value can sometimes come when, you know, your board is empty, and you don't really ever want your board to be empty. You always want to have creatures and have board control over your opponent, and this card's biggest use comes when you don't have that, so he's not a bad card. I'm not going to say that, but it's difficult to play with him because of that reason. He loses some forms of board control for you. So, yeah. Next up, Ancient Mage, 4-mana 2/5 with a battlecry, give adjacent minions spell damage +1. Again, just like with Ogre Magi, it costs too much to try to combo for spell damage, and the stats are not worth it for a 4-mana creature. Especially just being a 2/5, his stats are even worse than the Ogre Magi, so he's crap. He's honestly crap. Cultmaster. Good in some rush decks. It's a 4-mana 4/2 with a text. Whenever one of your other minions dies, draw a card. For this reason, Cultmaster's, has the potential to draw plenty of cards for you. It's most useful in aggro decks and rush decks. They're basically the same thing, where you have a bunch of creatures on the field and you plan to kill them all off in one turn, so that you get plenty of card draw. Since Cultmaster has so low of health, it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to keep the Cultmaster alive. Cultmaster's most often used in Paladin decks, because you could give it, buffed stats or Divine Shield and stuff like that. And Paladins can still manage to play Rush pretty well. On top of that, having the little token that they can summon for 2 mana means Cultmaster gets plenty of value. So this card is pretty useful in Paladin decks. I wouldn't really recommend running it in a Rush deck for any other class, unless you're starting out and you don't really have many forms of card draw. But Cultmaster can be pretty good in Rush Paladin decks. Next up, Dark Iron Dwarf, a 4-mana 4/4, with a battle cry of give a minion +2 attack this turn. The stats... Sorry. That probably sounded weird with the mic. Anyway, with regard to the Dwarf, the stats after 1 turn are lower than that of a Yeti. So what this basically means is this kind of summons a 2-drop, or a 2... No, I shouldn't phrase it that way, but this card has situational uses and it can be good for allowing minions to trade up into higher health minions, like something with 3 attack could now trade with something with 5 health, because it's gotten the attack buff. But again, that means that you're going to be relying on having smaller minions that you want to be able to buff up so they can trade with, higher value minions. This means this will be most valuable in rush decks, so yeah, unless you're playing a rush deck, a Yeti's a better substitute for this, because the Yeti's got more health and therefore better stats. So the Dwarf is usable in certain rush decks that want to get off damage like that, and have, their massive small creatures be able to trade up into larger creatures, but not useful in most other decks. So, yeah, that's the Dwarf. Defender of Argus is next. He's a 4-mana 2/3 with a battle cry of give adjacent minions +1/+1 and taunt. This means, at best, he will have the same effective stats as a Yeti, but split up among 2 adjacent creatures and, yeah, buffing them up. So Argus isn't played all that often because the potential for him to achieve maximum potential and the best value, you have to have 2 other minions on the board. Playing it with just 1 other minion on the board is circumstances, but still you want to have 2. I'm trying to think of where he's useful, because he's not a bad card. He's still used in certain decks, as he can give 2 creatures taunt, so that can be very valuable, but I don't know, he's still just used in rush decks, because again, you need creatures on the board, and you need plenty of them, so yeah, that's where Argus is most useful and where I'd recommend using him. Most other decks won't reliably have enough creatures on the board to get maximum value out of Argus, so that's what that is. Next up, Dread Corsair, a 4-mana 3/3 with taunt that costs 1 less per attack of your weapon. This card sucks. Straight up sucks. Just like just about every pirate in the game. It's supposed to combo well in weapon decks, just like every other pirate, but it does not. None of those decks are good enough to make them worth it. He's still only a 3/3. That being said, the funniest combos in the world are when you drop a True Silver champion with a paladin. It has 4 attack, therefore this card is free. You can then drop another 3/3 with taunt onto the field. It's one of the highest value plays you will ever make in 1 turn. But this card still sucks. Replace it with a Tazdingo. Yeah? 4 mana, 4/3/5 instead. Yeah, that's Dread Corsair. Bad card. Don't use him. Don't. Next up, Leroy Jenkins. He is a 4-drop legendary. He has charge. On a battle cry of summon 2 1/1 whelps for your opponent. There's the whelps. His stats are, he is a 6/2. That is a lot of damage. A lot of damage. 4 mana to deal 6 damage. He is basically a fireball. Except for he can be blocked by taunt. That's about it. He does summon a means for your opponent to kill him with the 2 1/1 whelps, but Leroy is typically used in combo decks where you drop him and then suddenly just wreck your opponent in one turn. Yeah, because he's like a fireball. With rogues, there's a very annoying combo where you play Leroy, and then you use Shadow Step. It's a free spell that returns a minion to your hand and makes it cost 2 less mana. So you could play a 4 mana Leroy, return him to your hand, and he costs 2 mana now. You play him again, boom, that's 12 damage in 1 turn. You can Shadow Step him again, because there's 2 in a deck. He costs 2 mana, boom, another 6 damage. That's 18 in 1 turn for 8 mana, assuming you have Leroy and 2 Shadow Steps in your hand. The deck that runs this is called Miracle Rogue, and it is a pain in the butt. But yeah, Leroy has a lot of potential in combo decks because, you know, there's just so much damage potential from him. Shamans too, if you can give him Wind Fury for 2 mana, boom, 12 damage for 6 mana. And then Rock Biters and stuff like that. I think you can get Leroy to do 22 in 1 turn that way. Something ridiculous like that. No, 24. But yeah. For 6 mana is that combo as well. Or not 6, 8, but you get my point. Yeah. Leroy is an absolutely great card, but he's most useful in combo decks, and you should only really play him when you plan on finishing an opponent off. Otherwise, you know, you're liable to just end up wasting him since he summons a means for your opponent to answer him. So, yeah. That's Leroy. If you don't know the story behind Leroy, I highly suggest you go on YouTube and look up World of Warcraft Leroy Jenkins. It is funny. I don't know how in the world you've been on the internet long enough to pop into the whole Hearthstone game and never have heard of this, but if you've managed it, go fix that. Anyway, next up, Marushawn Warden, a 4-drop 1/7 with taunt. Crap. It's crap. He won't trade with anything. He'll trade with 1-drops at best. If you're lucky. Maybe. He's horrible. He's just a little meat wall with taunt, that's it. Might as well be a 0/7. Not worth it. Don't play him. Period. Next up, Silver Moon Guardian, a 4 mana 3/3 with Divine Shield. Also crap. While it has Divine Shield, which means it will survive 1 trade, it only has 3 attack, and it only has 3 health. This means it can be answered by things like Shadow Word Pain. And on top of that, there are 4-drop cards that it still won't trade with, even after attacking twice. Once with the Divine Shield and once with its regular face. So, yeah, it's just no good at all. Its stats suck too much for retaining Divine Shield. You might as well just buff it for 1 attack and 2 health and make it a Yeti. I mean, yeah, Yeti is better than this card, period. So are a lot of other 4-drops. Just don't use this. It's bad. Next up, Spellbreaker, a 4 mana 4/3 with Battle Cry of Silence a minion. Silence is really undervalued in this meta. Their minions aren't typically buffed up to a point where silencing them is ever really worth it. So silence isn't valued that well. And if you compare this to a Yeti again, which is going to be the baseline of most of my comparisons, because it's an extremely good 4-drop, which everyone has, you're gaining an effect that typically you won't need, and sacrificing 2 health, not worth it. So, if in the Curse of Naxxramas patch, when they actually release the cards on the dungeon, silence suddenly becomes a necessary thing because of all the death rattles, then I will reconsider this card's value. But as it stands in this meta, silence is not worth it. Not for this card. There's other ways to silence cards that are just better methods. So, yeah, not worth it. Don't run him in a deck. Anyway, next up, Twilight Drake, a 4-mana 4/1 dragon. Don't let those stats fool you, because the battle cry is gain 1 health for each other card in your hand. So, decks that typically run on board control, because they'll have larger hands because they play it at the late game, are pretty good with this. There's a deck called Handlock, because Warlocks can draw so many cards in their hand. There are 2 cards, this and another one called Mountain Giant, we'll go over in the 7+ card review. But they gain power based on the number of cards in your hand. The Drake in that kind of a deck has maximum potential to be a 4/10 when played on turn 4. That's pretty crazy. That's absolutely freaking ridiculous. So, the Drake has a lot of value potential, especially if you don't play any other cards before you play him. Yeah. Drake is good. Drake is very good in decks that have large hands. That being said, don't run him in a rush deck. Don't run him in a combo deck. Combo decks could use other cards for their combos instead of a Drake. And rush decks will never have full hands, or hands that even have more than like 3 cards in them. So, this is good in control decks. Very good in control decks. That being said, yeah. Didn't need a decent sized hand with at least 5 cards in it, if you count the Drake, before he's worth playing at all. So, still, Twilight Drake is pretty crazy. That being said, he's one of those cards that actually is silenceable, because he is a 4/1 base stat, so silence will bring him down to that no matter what his health was, even if he was a 4/10. So, there's something to be said for silence, but it's rare enough that people play Drakes that silence still isn't really worth it. So, that's the Drake. Next up, Violet Teacher, a 4-mana 3/5, kind of like a Tazdingo. Whenever you cast a spell, summon a 1/1 Violet Apprentice. This makes it very good in combo decks. I'm sorry I left the whelp up for so long, I never even realized it was there. There's the Apprentice, though, to oh dear. There's a Druid deck called Token Druid, which basically runs on casting a bunch of spells to get a lot of these little apprentices out, and then buffs them all up to become really powerful threats. And Zerg rushes you in 1 turn, so... But that's what combo decks do, you know? They just kill you in 1 turn, so... Violet Apprentice is good in combo decks. I'm just gonna leave it there. Yep. Let's get rid of this before I leave it up all stream long. That'd be awkward. That's it for the 4-drop card review. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed. If you didn't enjoy, send me some hate mail. I'll be sure to ignore it.